Before we move on to Star Trek, I want to ask you about a couple other movies that you did that I really like and remember. The first one, I say remember because it was The Day After. And when it came out, I was too young. I was one of those kids that wasn't allowed to watch it because honestly, I really don't know why, what it would have done to me. But I've seen it after, and it really wouldn't have traumatized me. But tell me what you remember about making and The Day After.
Well, I remember a great deal because The Day After, probably to date, is probably the most worthwhile thing I ever got to do with my life. It's a movie about what would happen if there was a nuclear war. And it was broadcast in 1983 on ABC, and nothing like it, I think, had ever been attempted on television before. And Bill Buckley and Phyllis Schlafly and assorted conservative folks were terrified that this film was going to change America's nuclear policy, which, oddly enough, is exactly what happened, though none of us could have foreseen it at the time. It became the most watched movie for television ever made. 100 million people saw it in one night. Mm-hmm. And that number is never likely to be broken because there's so many channels now that I don't think you'll ever... So I retire as the champion. Yeah. And there are endless stories about the making of The Day After. Many of them are in the book. As I said, they're in The View from the Bridge. But the most interesting one, in a way, was the notion that Ronald Reagan saw this movie and was so upset by it, and he recounts this in his memoirs, and his biographer, Edmund Morris, also recounts it, that it really did change his mind about the idea, the concept of a winnable nuclear war. And he went off to Reykjavik 6 months later and met Mr. Gorbachev and signed the intermediate range missile agreement with Gorbachev, much to the fury of the conservative wing of his own party. But I think that, and I got a postcard from somebody later, just somebody who read it in the paper and said, don't think your movie didn't have something to do with this. And at the time, I didn't quite understand how prescient that was, because it wasn't until his memoirs came out that we learned, and I learned from several other sources since, what a powerful effect the movie had on Reagan, who sort of surrendered his concept of the winnable nuclear war after seeing it. So that's why I call it the most worthwhile thing I've gotten to do with my life to date.
Right, and like I said, I was of that age. I would think I was in 5th or 6th grade when it came out, and that one, along with the miniseries V that came out at the time, I wasn't allowed to watch, but I still snuck out and watched it. And I do remember when I first saw The Day After through fingers and behind couches, that when I snuck in some looks, I do remember with some very powerful imagery. Martin Landau I've always liked as an actor. He was very good in it. And watching it now that I was older, it still has still very powerful imagery, like I said, and I can see why it changed Ronald Reagan's mind. It's a very powerful movie.
Thank you.
And the other movie that I want to talk to you about, only because it's Volunteers, only because it has my favorite actor, Tom Hanks, and John Candy, who I admired a lot while he was still living with us. So tell me any memories you have on Volunteers.
Well, Volunteers was a really fun film to make. It was the only time I got to do a flat-out snarky comedy, and I had just gotten married, and I was in love, and I was a very happy period of time, and this rather giddy farce, which I did not write, was offered to me to direct, and I thought, what fun. And, in fact, it turned out to be a lot of fun to make, and once again, my leading man was falling in love with his leading lady. I seem to have a gift for this sort of casting inspiration. And so, yeah, it was, we were in Mexico. We shot in Oaxaca and disguised it as Thailand, which turned out not to be very difficult. And it's just sort of it's a spoof, it's a farce, it's a silly giggle of a movie. I think when it was finished, because it had the same cast as Splash, John Candy and Tom Hanks, that the studio thought it was going to be like Splash. You should sort of market it to kids, which was a mistake. It was not a kids' movie. It was more for college kids and older.
Right.
But eventually, it sort of found its audience.
Directing Tom Hanks, did you have any clue of the superstar he was going to become?
That's a tough question, because it's very hard to think back and sort of wipe away all his accomplishments to remember. I remember thinking that he was an extremely gifted guy, also a very lovely human being. When we first began, I'd come to work in the morning and I'd say, "How are you?" And he would say, "Swinging." And after, I don't know, about a week of this, I said, if you keep doing that, we're never going to get to know each other. Maybe that's the way you want it. But I bet there's a lot more to you than swinging, and there's a lot more to me. And we actually, at that point, he said, because actors, I think, are congenitally wary. You go to work with a director, and the next thing you want to know is he crazy? How crazy? Are we all going to follow him off a cliff? So they start out a little tentative, and I think Tom began by sort of protecting himself. And then, as we did get to know each other, we became friends, and I don't know that I knew exactly how successful he was going to become, but I always thought he was a person of enormous gifts, professional and personal.
So again, we're talking to Nicholas Meyer, who's the writer, director, author. Now the book is called The View from the Bridge, Memories of Star Trek and a Life in Hollywood. We're going to take a little break right now. When we come back, we'll get into some Star Trek. I know you guys want to talk about that. So we're talking to Nicholas Meyer. We'll continue the conversation in just a few minutes. Don't go anywhere.
Geek Speak Radio Show will be right back.